The Sunday morning Mass was proceeding peacefully. The sun, filtered through the colorful stained glass windows of the church, painted the marble floor with patches of multicolored light. The soft scent of incense filled the air as the congregation recited their prayers in unison, creating an atmosphere of peace and devotion. The priest, standing before the altar, conducted the ceremony with a calm and solemn voice, echoing softly against the stone walls of the sanctuary. Amid the serenity, the church doors creaked open, catching the attention of a few of the closer parishioners. A boy no older than 10 rushed in. He wore simple clothes, and his expression clashed with the peacefulness of the surroundings. His eyes were red and swollen, as though he had been crying without end, and his labored breathing betrayed that something was terribly wrong with him. Without stopping, the boy hurried down the center aisle, ignoring the confused stares that began to follow him. His movements were awkward, almost desperate. He didn't stop until he reached the statue of Mary, which stood in a corner near the altar. Kneeling abruptly before her, the boy began to sob uncontrollably. His hands trembled as he extended his arms toward the serene figure of the Virgin, as if expecting a response, some comfort that only she could offer. The murmuring of the congregation grew as everyone silently observed the strange and unsettling scene. The priest halted his sermon, his eyes filled with concern, and slowly descended from the altar, approaching the boy. The boy's sobs were loud and unrestrained, piercing the air with a palpable anguish that touched everyone present. "My son, what's happening?" the priest asked in a soft and calming voice, kneeling beside the boy. But the boy did not answer. He continued to cry, his words mixed with incomprehensible sobs. People began to stir in their pews, some standing, trying to make sense of what was causing such pain. The serene atmosphere had vanished, replaced by an air of anxiety and unease. The priest reached out, lightly touching the boy's shoulder. "It's okay, you can tell me what happened. I'm here to help," he said, his voice filled with compassion. But the boy seemed not to hear. His crying only intensified, as if every word he tried to form was choked by an even greater sorrow. Some parishioners began to step closer, whispering among themselves. "What could have happened to him?" murmured one woman. "Maybe he lost someone," suggested another, her face marked by concern. Among the whispers, the oldest and most devout of the churchgoers, Mrs. Esther, watched intently, her eyes fixed on the boy. To her, there was something more in that cry, something almost divine. "The boy is receiving a sign," Mrs. Esther murmured, clutching her hands in prayer. The priest, unsure of what else to do, tried to comfort the boy with a gentle embrace. "You're not alone," he said. "We're here with you. Please, tell us what happened." It was at that moment that the boy, still sobbing, finally muttered a few words. She's gone. My mom promised," he said, his voice broken by sobs, barely able to breathe. His words were jumbled, but they were enough to make the priest and the nearby parishioners exchange worried glances. Something terrible had happened, and now everyone was starting to realize that this was more serious than it seemed. Mrs. Esther, her eyes glowing with emotion, whispered once more, "It's a sign from Mary. He's here for a reason, Father. His mother made a promise. We can't ignore this." The priest, though a man of faith, hesitated. He felt the boy's pain as something deeply human and real, but the idea that it could hold a divine significance was beginning to take root in his mind, as well as in the minds of everyone present. The silence, broken only by the boy's sobs, grew heavier with each passing moment. "We need to take him to a quieter place," the priest said gently, trying to lead the boy away from the statue. But the boy resisted, clinging even more tightly to the image of Mary, as if moving away would mean losing something forever. The boy refused to let go of the statue of Mary. Each attempt the priest made to pull him away only resulted in more resistance, and the boy's sobs grew louder. The parishioners, who had been watching the scene with concern, were now gripped by a mixture of fear and curiosity. What had driven this boy to such a state of despair? And why was he so attached to the image of Mary? The priest, realizing that he couldn't force the boy to leave without causing more distress, decided to step back. He looked around, seeking support from the crowd, but everyone seemed as confused as he was. The murmuring among the congregation grew louder, and speculations began to arise. Some believed the boy was in shock from a family tragedy, while others, like Mrs. Esther, firmly believed this was a divine sign. "It's Mary's intercession," Mrs. Esther said, her eyes fixed on the boy. "Something very important is about to happen, Father. We cannot ignore the signs." The priest, a pragmatic man despite his faith, tried to stay calm and think rationally. He knew he couldn't let the situation continue much longer. He approached the boy again, this time with a different approach. Instead of trying to pull him away from the statue, he knelt beside the boy as an equal and spoke in a gentle voice. "I understand that you're hurting," the priest said. "I know you lost someone important, your mother, right? But Mary is here to listen. You can talk to me or you can speak directly to her. We're not here to take you away, but to help you find the peace you're looking for." The boy, still sobbing, seemed to respond to the priest's words. His crying softened a little, and he raised his eyes, looking at the priest for the first time. His eyes were swollen but filled with a pain that no one there could imagine. He mumbled again, this time his words were slightly clearer. "My mom made a promise," he said, his voice trembling. "She promised Mary that if she got better, she would give everything we had." The priest took a deep breath, now beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The boy believed that his mother's promise to Mary had not been fulfilled. And now, with his mother gone, he felt it was his responsibility to honor that promise. The silence following the boy's revelation was profound. Everyone in the church stopped murmuring, captivated by the boy's words. The priest, feeling the weight of what had been said, looked at the boy with newfound understanding. The child was carrying a guilt and burden that no child should bear. "She promised to give everything you had?" the priest asked carefully, trying to remain calm and help the boy continue. He knew that each word was painful for the child, but also understood it was necessary to help him relieve this heavy load. The boy nodded, his eyes still full of tears. She said that if Mary cured her, she would give everything to the church, but she passed away. She didn't have time to fulfill the promise." The parishioners, who had been passively observing, began to move again. The air of mystery and confusion gave way to a mood of concern and empathy. Now that they knew the reason behind the boy's pain, some of the churchgoers seemed even more determined to believe that what was happening had a significance beyond the ordinary. Mrs. Esther, always a fervent defender of the faith, stood up from her pew and approached the altar. "This boy is here for a reason. His mother couldn't fulfill her promise, but he came to the church because he feels it's his duty to do it for her. Father, we can't ignore this." The priest, though touched by Mrs. Esther's words, still tried to balance the situation. He knew the boy was deeply distressed, and as the shepherd of these souls, it was his duty to help the community not to jump to conclusions. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the gravity of the situation and the boy's devotion to his mother's promise. "My child, Mary understands your suffering. She knows what your mother promised and also understands that you are just a child. You don't have to carry this guilt alone," said the priest, trying to ease the weight of responsibility the boy felt. "Your mother made that promise out of love, but we must not forget that your emotional health is important too." The boy, still clutching the statue, looked at the priest with eyes full of confusion. "But if I don't fulfill the promise, what if she—" he began, but his voice broke, swallowed by his sobs. He believed that his mother's spirit would not be at peace until the promise was fulfilled. The priest took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to calm the boy. He knew this was a delicate situation, and the child was carrying an enormous emotional burden for someone so young. The pressure of his mother's promise seemed to crush him, and the priest needed to handle this with care. "Listen, my son," the priest said, keeping his voice low and serene. "Promises made in faith are important, but what matters most is the love your mother had for you. She made that promise hoping to be healed, but now she is at peace with Mary. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to fulfill this promise. The boy looked at the priest with a mixture of pain and doubt. He wanted to believe the priest's words, but the weight of the promise still crushed him. But she wanted it so much. I can't just ignore it, he said, his voice faltering as tears once again filled his eyes. The parishioners around were moved, some murmuring quiet prayers, while others cast compassionate glances at the boy. Mrs. Esther, who remained nearby, clasped her hands in prayer, as if waiting for something extraordinary to happen. The priest then placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. You are not alone. We are here with you. If this promise is important to you, we can find a way to help. But you don't have to carry it alone. The boy, still in shock, looked around, noticing the supportive gazes. However, he remained fixated on the idea that the promise had to be fulfilled. She said she would give everything we had to the church. He murmured, staring at the statue of Mary, his voice barely audible. If I don't do it, the weight of the sacrifice he felt was necessary was clear to everyone. The tension in the church grew, and the parishioners began to question how they could help the boy release this guilt without compromising his emotional well-being. The atmosphere inside the church became tense. The murmurs of the parishioners grew louder as they discussed what to do. Some believed the priest was right and that the boy shouldn't bear this burden alone. Others, like Mrs. Esther, saw the moment as a matter of faith. The promise should be fulfilled in some way, and perhaps the community could come together to do it. This boy cannot carry his mother's will on his own, said a young woman standing near the entrance. We can help. Don't we all have something we can donate in honor of this promise? The suggestion made some nod in agreement. It seemed like a simple solution, but others were uneasy. For many, what was happening to the boy was more than a material issue. The emotional pressure he felt was the real problem, and forcing the fulfillment of the promise could worsen his condition. This is something he needs to come to terms with in time, suggested an older man, his gray hair and worried expression reflecting his concern. He's just a child. Fulfilling this promise won't bring his mother back. Mrs. Esther, however, wasn't convinced. To her, the faith was clear, and what the boy felt was a calling that couldn't be ignored. If his mother made this promise, then she knew what she was doing, and he, as her son, is here to honor that. We can help, yes, but we must allow him to approach Mary in the way he feels necessary. The priest watched the debate in silence, feeling the weight of responsibility growing with each word. He knew the boy was emotionally fragile, and any hasty action could have serious consequences. But he also knew that ignoring the guilt the boy carried could trap him in a cycle of suffering. Finally, the priest raised his hand, asking for silence. The church fell into a tense quiet, everyone awaiting his decision. This boy is in a very delicate moment, said the priest, his calm voice echoing through the sacred space. The promise his mother made was made in faith, but we must not forget that faith is a path of love and understanding, not sacrifice and pain. We must help him understand this. Some nodded in agreement, but Mrs. Esther still seemed reluctant. But Father, he came here because he feels he must fulfill that promise. We can't deny that Mary brought him to us for a reason. The priest sighed, realizing the tension between reason and faith was becoming stronger. He knew he would have to find a balance to resolve the situation. Mary understands his suffering, as do we, said the priest. We will help this boy, but we must remember that he is only a child, and his emotional health is our priority. Let's guide him with faith and compassion. The boy, who had been listening in silence, looked at the priest with eyes full of doubt. He wanted to believe he could find solace, but he was still trapped in the guilt of not fulfilling his mother's promise. The community, now united in their attempt to help, approached, offering both material and emotional support. Silence once again fell over the church, interrupted only by the boy's muffled sobs. The parishioners watched, waiting for the priest to guide the situation with wisdom, but the boy seemed determined. Still kneeling at the feet of the statue of Mary, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if seeking strength from somewhere deep within. The priest tried to speak again, his voice gentle and reassuring. "You don't need to do this now, my son. Mary understands the pain you're feeling. Your mother made the promise out of love, and you don't have to carry this burden alone." The boy, his eyes still filled with tears, slowly rose to his feet. Everyone in the room followed his movements with attentive eyes, but kept their distance, respecting the emotional struggle he was clearly enduring. Trembling slightly, he reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out something small and shiny. It was a rosary. The boy looked at the object with reverence and sadness. It was the only possession he had from his mother, the last physical link that connected them. He knew that giving it up meant more than just fulfilling the promise. It was an act of sacrifice, of total surrender. He believed that by offering the rosary, he would finally fulfill his mother's wish and ensure her peace. Without a word, he approached the statue of Mary and, with trembling hands, placed the rosary at her feet. The small chain glistened in the soft light streaming through the stained glass, creating an almost mystical effect. The church was utterly silent. No one dared to interrupt the moment. The priest watched with a mixture of sadness and respect. He knew that for the boy, this was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was the closure of a painful chapter in his life. Though the priest rationally wished the boy didn't have to part with something so meaningful, he understood the emotional weight it carried for the child. When the rosary was laid on the ground, a wave of emotion swept through the church. Some parishioners began to pray silently, while others watched with tear-filled eyes. The boy, still kneeling, stared at the rosary for a few moments, as if expecting something extraordinary to happen. Suddenly, something unexpected occurred. The rosary, lying at the feet of the statue, glowed intensely for a brief moment. The light was gentle, but clear enough for everyone to notice. A collective gasp of surprise swept through the church, and the parishioners, who had been silent, now whispered in awe. "It's a sign," Mrs. Esther whispered, her eyes shining with devotion. Mary accepted his sacrifice. The priest, though skeptical about the idea of a visible miracle, couldn't deny what had just happened. He knew this would have a profound impact on everyone present, especially the boy. With a trembling voice, the priest approached the altar again and made the sign of the cross, inviting everyone to join him in prayer. The boy, still kneeling, seemed to be in a state of shock. He stared at the glowing rosary, and for the first time since he entered the church, a sense of relief washed over his face. His crying ceased, and a deep silence settled over him. He still felt the pain of his loss, but something within him had shifted. He felt, deep in his soul, that his mother was finally at peace. The people around him began to pray aloud, their voices filled with emotion. The priest, still trying to process what he had just witnessed, led a special prayer in gratitude for Mary's sign. It was impossible to deny the symbolic power of the moment, and everyone knew that something extraordinary had occurred during that Mass. The boy, now silent, gazed at the rosary at the feet of the statue. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he felt that something greater was present. A feeling of peace enveloped him, something he hadn't felt since his mother's passing. For the first time, he believed that maybe he didn't need to carry that burden alone anymore. The priest, finishing the prayer, looked at the boy and said, "Mary heard you, my son. Your mother is at peace now, and so should you be. We are all here for you." The community, united by the emotion of the moment, began to gather around the boy, offering words of comfort and support. There was a feeling of togetherness among everyone present, something that transcended what they had imagined when the Mass began. The rosary, still softly glowing, now represented something much bigger: love, faith, and the hope for a more peaceful future for that boy. After the unexpected miracle, the church was wrapped in an atmosphere of reverence and emotion. The parishioners approached the boy, who was still kneeling, now calmer. Words of consolation began to flow, and he was surrounded by gestures of support. Some people placed their hands on his shoulders, while others simply whispered prayers around him. It was as if the entire community, once divided, was now united around the boy. Mrs. Esther, always the most devout, carefully approached and knelt beside the boy. "You are not alone," she said, her voice full of kindness. "Mary brought you here so that we could know your pain. And now, we are all here to help you move forward." The boy, although still shaken, felt a wave of relief as he realized he didn't have to carry that burden alone anymore. He looked at Mrs. Esther and then at the priest, who stood nearby, offering him an encouraging smile. The boy, for the first time, allowed a small smile to appear on his lips, a sign that he was slowly beginning to accept the support being offered to him. The priest, sensing the need to guide the community, stepped forward and signaled for everyone to stand. Today, we witnessed something extraordinary. No matter how each of us interprets what happened, one thing is certain. We must take care of this boy. He has lost so much, but now he has all of us. We are a family for him, and together, we can help him find peace. The parishioners nodded in silent agreement, moved by the priest's words. They knew that from that moment on, their lives were intertwined with the boy's. The sense of unity and responsibility grew as people drew even closer to the boy, offering their time, resources, and, above all, their love. The boy, though still grieving his mother's loss, felt a new sense of comfort. He was no longer alone. The community had become a new foundation in his life, and from that day forward, he could begin to rebuild his journey without the weight of guilt. In the days that followed, the community kept their promise to care for the boy. He was taken in by a local family, who offered him a loving home and the certainty that he would always have a place with them. The priest visited frequently, ensuring the boy was emotionally well and receiving all the support he needed. The church itself also transformed. The event of the rosary that glowed during the Mass became a symbol of faith and renewal for the parishioners. Everyone who had witnessed the moment shared their experiences with the town, and the story quickly spread. The boy, now calmer and at peace, continued to attend church, feeling more and more connected to his new family and his renewed faith. The rosary, which remained at the feet of the statue of Mary, was a constant reminder of the promise the boy's mother had made, but also that love and compassion could heal even the deepest pains. Whenever the boy looked at the rosary, he felt connected not only to his mother but also to the new life he had begun. Over time, he began to smile again, and his sorrow gradually gave way to hope. He knew that with the support of the community and the strength he had found in Mary, he could move forward, honoring his mother's memory but without bearing the burden alone. The priest, always attentive, helped him understand that his mother was at peace, and that he, too, deserved to find his own peace. The Mass, which had begun as a moment of pain and despair, ended up becoming a new beginning for everyone involved. The community, united by faith and the miracle they had witnessed, became a true family for the boy, proving that love and unity can overcome even the greatest challenges.